It's a great opportunity to welcome Professor Keith Grint today, who's come hot foot from a session of talking with the National School of Government's Sunningdale Institute to a range of senior civil servants. And Keith is here today to talk about some of his ideas and thinking around particular aspects of leadership. Welcome, Keith. Very good to have you here. And I'd like to kind of start off by jumping straight in, if I may. It's in response to the paper that you recently wrote, which was, I think, entitled around kind of the social construction of leadership. You know, very fascinating and kind of curious title. And I suppose I'd like to start by trying to kind of package up some of what you're saying and invite your views on it. What you're saying, as I understand it, is something that kind of goes straight to the heart of leadership. And that is that some people might propose that leadership is about a response to a given situation. So in times of crisis, that triggers a certain leadership response. In terms of change or any number of scenarios, the leadership kind of signal is given, and then leaders take their cue from that and act accordingly. But what you're saying in your thesis challenges that in every way. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Okay, well, I mean, what you're describing is what we would call a contingency or a situational approach, the assumption that the role of the leader is to work out what the situation is and take the appropriate decisions. So if it's a crisis, you take certain kinds of action. If it's something else, you do something else. What I'm suggesting is we think about it in terms of a situated rather than situational approach. So a situational approach would be work out what the situation is, then do something. A situational approach takes it much more on the active side of the leader. So what you've got is an assumption that the leader is at least partly responsible in contestation with others for the construction or the constitution of the context or the situation. In other words, rather than responding to something like a crisis, one of the ways that we know successful leaders operate is that they construct something as a crisis, and on that basis they then take certain kinds of actions. We know, for example, that in terms of control or change policies and operations, most of those fail. One of the things that everybody talks about is the burning platform. If you don't have this crisis, you will not be able to ensure organizational change. So what successful leaders do is they constitute something as a crisis, i.e. they develop the burning platform. Now, on the one hand, that looks like I'm talking about the role of spin, and my argument is not that there's spin and the truth. My argument is that we don't really know what the truth is. What we know is there are different accounts of what the situation might be. So there's this probably a permanent contestation between different people's versions of what the situation is.
Sure.
And if you're successful, if you can persuade people that the figures that you've got in front of you constitute a crisis, then you can persuade them to take certain kinds of action that you probably couldn't take if you couldn't persuade them there was a crisis on board. So it's bringing a much more active role on the part of the individual or group decision making here, rather than people being simply passive and responding. They may look as though they're just responding to something, but actually they're probably being very busy in preparing the situation that they then appear to respond to.
Sure. So for those people, let's say those people in the civil service who hold leadership positions, what you're arguing is that they should pay attention to the way in which given situations are constituted, how they're kind of assembled, so that then action can follow in a particular way. The question I have for you is around the ability of individual leaders to constitute that by themselves, or whether or not actually they're kind of competing with lots of other people in terms of how a situation is put together.
I think there are two aspects to this. The first one is that it's probably not individuals, except in very rare cases. It's probably as a group issue we're talking about. So it's about how the group that act as the decision makers, how they constitute a certain form of vocabulary or a certain narrative line about what the figures of the situation actually mean. So the first issue is it individual? And the answer is probably not. The second part of the answer, is it about competing individuals, or is it about competition? And the answer is it's almost always about competition. There are always varying and diverse accounts of what the situation is. The issue is not is it true or not. The issue is who has the power, the compulsive power to persuade people that actually this is the situation rather than that's the situation. So you always get contestation about what the situation is. And the important thing to probably understand is it's not really about who is truer. It's about who is more persuasive, because very often the people that are responding to the account don't have access to the data to be able to say whether it's true or not. Yeah. Huge amounts of what we do is based upon levels of trust. So it's not, do I believe X because X is telling me the truth and Y is not. But actually, I believe X because I think X is a trustworthy person and why probably isn't. So that's what tends to happen, is can you construct a situation that's trustworthy rather than a situation which is true?
Sure.
Because we're probably never going to find out whether it's true or not.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because both of us in different ways are in the field of kind of leadership development. And it's a difficult question, but what do you think kind of on a day-to-day basis this might mean for people in leadership positions in terms of, I don't know, how they do their job, how they engage with people, with the followers that they're involved in? If I mean, what you describe is a more complex environment within which leaders have to operate.
Yeah, well, the first thing is perhaps to stop being quite so passive and reactive and think about the proactive aspects, as the people who are successful are much more proactive. Sure. Rather than reactive. And the other aspect is to think about, how do you persuade people? And one of the answers is, if people are engaged in the process by which you come to a decision, they're much more likely to be persuaded by it because they're involved in it. So one of the things that we currently do a lot is we tend to take a horizontal slice from the top, the strategic leadership group, and we assume that because they have allegedly all the knowledge and all the intelligence, they're the people that come up with the right analysis and the right answers. But we know that in reality, most change programs actually don't work. 75% in theory fail. And one of the reasons strikes me is that what you're not doing is engaging the people who are involved in the running out or the execution of the process. They're not engaged in the construction of the problem analysis and the solution. So rather than going for this horizontal top slice, if you go for a vertical slice, whereby you take people that represent all kinds of interests and engage those in people trying to analyse what the problem is and where you might go from that, then you've got different understanding of what the problem is, because from the bottom, for example, the problem isn't the same as it is from the top. Mm-hmm. From the top, it might just be a kind of logical analysis of whether we need to expand into China or reduce the numbers of nurses or whatever it is. But if you're a nurse, the problem is not seen as, do I need to reconstruct this group? It's actually, how do I fulfill the interests of the people that I'm representing? I think the former one, the horizontal one, always locks into a notion that there's just one logic. And it's a kind of a logical approach, and the more brain power you've got, the better it is. And that isn't what persuades people. It isn't about logic. It's about self-interest very often. It's about trying to understand, why would I bother to follow you? Or why would I bother to follow what you've just asked me to do, unless it's in my interest or the interest of the group as I understand it?
I mean, what I find very, very interesting about that is that what you're suggesting in part is about kind of leaders recognising that they don't know and dipping into the organisation and kind of constructing with other people what the kind of journey should be, I suppose. But that's challenging, isn't it, for individual leaders, if there is this expectation that they are there to provide answers. And you gave a fantastic account of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I think illustrates that point quite interestingly. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, what happens in the Cuban Missile Crisis, you've got the Soviets are allegedly deploying missiles into Cuba. And at that point, of course, the Americans are extremely worried about what the implication of this is. And when they first get information about what the Soviets are doing, Kennedy organises a meeting with his military advisors and his civilian advisors and asks them, what should we do now we know the situation is X? And the military are very keen to go ahead with the bombing of Cuba, because as far as they're concerned, the intelligence seems to suggest that the missiles have not been tipped with their nuclear weapons at that point. So if you bomb them instantly in the next 24 hours, they're not that lethal. And then the US military are suggesting there should be a follow-up invasion to remove Castro. Now, Kennedy's approach to this is basically, I don't know what to do. The solution seems to be that we go for an all-out war and risk nuclear retaliation. And in reality, we now know that those missiles were actually armed, and there would have been a nuclear retaliation, and there would have been probably a nuclear exchange. So Kennedy is not willing to risk that because he's not certain that's the right thing to do, but he isn't certain what the right thing to do is. So what he does is deciding not to decide. He basically says, thank you for the information, gentlemen, and walks off. And of course, for those people used to very decisive kinds of leadership, that's indecisive, weak, and a manifestation of a major leadership crisis. But for Kennedy, it's none of those things. It's because he doesn't really know what to do, but he knows there must be another way. And what you see pan out in the film, the 13 Days film, is that eventually somebody in the room comes up with an idea which they work through, which actually solves the problem. And it's not the military option, it's a different option. And Kennedy doesn't know about this at the time. He just knows that it's not the right thing to do, to be decisive.
Sure.
And we're very used to the assumption that leaders really ought to be decisive all the time. They should know what to do. And if they don't know what to do, they should still be decisive. And when you're faced with a wicked problem to which there is no answer, the role of the leader is to admit that, first of all, there isn't an answer, and secondly, to assure people that there is a process by which we might ameliorate the problem. So you're not looking really for the scientific correct answer. What you're looking for is a way to engage all those people that need to be engaged in some collaborative process to make some impact upon the problem.